Listening 7. Library.
Listen to part of a conversation between a student and a librarian.
Hi, how can I help you?
Hi, I'm looking for some material on reserve for Business 210.
Okay. Well, who's the professor? You see, we keep the files under the professor's name because there are a couple of sections, and the requirements are a little different.
Oh, okay. It's, Dr. Parsons.
Parsons? I don't see any books.
I think it's a DVD.
Oh, yes, here it is. Oh, wait, actually, there are 2 of them. But that's all right. Now, all I need's your student ID.
No problem.
There you go. Now, these will be due back at the desk in 2 hours.
2 hours? But that won't even give me time to go home.
Oh, you can't leave the library with reserved materials. You have to use them here. But we have some DVD players in the booths behind the reference section. I think there are several free now.
But I have to take notes and, I don't think I can get everything done in 2 hours.
Well, you can't take materials out again until someone else has used them, because the professor only left 1 copy of each. Sorry. Look, maybe 2 hours will be enough.
I don't think so. These are case studies and we're supposed to be able to discuss them.
Oh, I see. When do you have class?
Tomorrow morning. I know I should have come in earlier, but this isn't my only class. I had an exam earlier today, and I was just waiting to get that out of the way.
I see. Well, look, why don't
Isn't
you...
there any way to get an exception to the policy?
I'm afraid not.
Oh. Okay, then. Let me just check out one of the DVDs. That way, if I finish it, I can check out the other one for 2 hours, right?
Sure, that's perfectly fine. And here's a thought. I don't know if it will work for you since you have a morning class, but if you check out reserved material less than 2 hours before the library closes, then you can have it overnight.
Overnight?
Yes, but you have to have it back when the library opens the next day, and...
But I could do that. Oh, I'm sorry. You were going to say.
Well, if you don't return the material to the reserve desk when the library opens, then there's a $10 fine for the first hour and a $5 fine for every hour after that. That it's late, I mean. The usual fee's $1 for every hour, but when it's an overnight...
Ouch.
Yeah, it's a stiff fine because we need students to take the privilege seriously. Otherwise, other students who need to use the reserve materials wouldn't have access to them.
Oh, I understand.
And another thing. Sometimes more than one person's trying to use the overnight privilege, so sometimes when you wait until the end of the day...
Oh, and there isn't any way to put your name on a list or anything?
No, not really. It's first come, first served.
Okay. Then I think I'll go ahead and take the one DVD out now because I can still try to get the second one tonight, overnight. Can't I?
Sure. I'll tell you what. Come back a little before 9.
Okay. Will you be here? I mean, I'd rather come back to you.
I'll be here until the library closes.
Well then.
Do you still want to take out one of the DVDs?
Yeah, I might as well get one of them out of the way so I'll only have one left to watch.
Oh, wait a minute. Your ID.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I showed it to you.
You did, but I need to keep it here at the desk until you return the materials.
35. What does the man need from the librarian? "36. What is the man's problem? 37. Listen again to part of a conversation, and then answer the following question.
I don't know if it will work for you since you have a morning class, but if you check out reserved material less than 2 hours before the library closes, then you can have it overnight.
Overnight?
What does the man feel when he says this?
Overnight?
"38. What is the policy for materials on reserve? 39. What does the librarian imply when she tells the man to return at 9 o'clock?
'Listening 8. Literature class.
Listen to part of a lecture in a literature class.
Today, we'll discuss transcendentalism. Transcendentalism, which is a philosophical and literary movement that developed in New England in the early 19th century. Transcendentalism began with the formation in 1836 of the Transcendental Club in Boston, Massachusetts, by a group of artists and writers. There's evidence that the group was involved in somewhat of a protest against the intellectual climate of Harvard. Interestingly enough, many of the Transcendentalists were actually Harvard educated, but they never met in Cambridge. Remember, at this time, Harvard had only 11 professors, and at least 11 members could be expected to attend a meeting of the Transcendental Club. So, their intellectual community was large enough to rival the Harvard faculty. All right, then. Their criticism of Harvard was that the professors were too conservative and old-fashioned, which, come to think of it, isn't an unusual attitude for students when they talk about their professors. But in fairness, the classroom method of recitation that was popular at Harvard required the repetition of a lesson without any operational understanding of it. In contrast, the Transcendentalists considered themselves modern and liberal because they preferred a more operational approach to education. Bronson Alcott translated Transcendentalism into pedagogy by encouraging the students to think, using dialogues and journals to develop and record their ideas. Language was viewed as the connection between the individual and society. In 1834, Alcott established the Temple School near Boston Commons and later founded a form of adult education, which he referred to as conversation. This was really a process whereby the give and take in a conversation became more important than the doctrine that a teacher might have been inclined to pass on to students, an approach that stood in diametric opposition to the tradition at Harvard that encouraged students to memorize their lessons. The Transcendental group also advanced a reaction against the rigid Puritanism of the period, especially insofar as it emphasized society at the expense of the individual. The Puritans, I mean. According to the Transcendentalists, the justification of all social organizations is the improvement of the individual. So, in the literature of the time, the Transcendentalists insisted that it was basic human nature to engage in self-expression, and many interpreted this as encouragement for them to write essays and other opinion pieces. One of the most distinguished members of the club was Ralph Waldo Emerson, who served as editor of the Transcendentalists' literary magazine, The Dial. His writing stressed the importance of the individual. In one of his best-known essays, Self-Reliance, he appealed to intuition as a source of ethics, asserting that people should be the judge of their own actions without the rigid restrictions of society. You can imagine the reaction of the church, in particular the Unitarian Church, in which many of the intellectuals held membership. If individuals were responsible for their own code of ethics, then the clergy and the entire church organization was threatened. Perhaps because they were encouraged to think for themselves, the Transcendentalists came up with several options for living out their philosophies. Many were devoted to the idea of a utopian society, or at least to a pastoral retreat without class distinctions, where everyone would be responsible for tending the gardens and maintaining the buildings, preparing the food, and so forth. And quite a few were involved in some sort of communal living. Brook Farm was probably the most successful of these cooperatives, although it lasted only 6 years. Brook Farm and some of the other experimental communities brought to the surface the problem that the Transcendentalists faced when they tried to reconcile a cooperative society and individual freedom. Both Emerson and Thoreau declined to participate in Brook Farm because they maintained that improvement had to begin with an individual, not a group. From 1841 to 1843, Emerson and Thoreau lived and worked together in Emerson's home, exchanging ideas, developing their philosophies, and writing. Upon leaving Emerson's home, Thoreau built a small cabin along the shores of Walden Pond near Concord, Massachusetts, where he lived alone for 2 years, devoting himself to the study of nature and to writing. He published an account of his experiences in Walden, a book that's generally acknowledged as the most original and sincere contribution to literature by the Transcendentalists. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Transcendentalism didn't change the educational system, and it certainly didn't reform the church in any significant way, but it did, in a sense, change the direction of American social and political culture, because Transcendentalism evolved from its initial literary roots into a force that shaped the way a democratic society was interpreted on the North American continent.
40. What does this lecturer mainly discuss? (41) Listen again to part of the lecture and then answer the following question.
All right, then. Their criticism of Harvard was that the professors were too conservative and old-fashioned, which, come to think of it, isn't an unusual attitude for students when they talk about their professors.
Why does the professor say this?
Which, come to think of it, isn't an unusual attitude for students when they talk about their professors.
(42) According to the professor, what was true about the Puritans? (43) Why did the church oppose the Transcendental movement? (44) Why did the professor mention Walden? (45) According to the professor, what was the most lasting contribution of Transcendentalism?
Listening 9. General Science Class.
Listen to part of a discussion in a general science class.
Okay, this is a general science course, and as such, the first thing I want you to understand is the scientific method. In your book, the definition of the scientific method is an organized approach to explaining observed facts with a model of nature that must be tested and then modified or discarded if it fails to pass the tests. So, let's take that apart and talk about it. What are observed facts? Anyone?
I'll try.
Okay.
Isn't a fact supposed to be a statement that everyone agrees on?
So you'd say that a fact is objectively true.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Okay, that sounds good. But what about this? We consider it a fact that the sun rises each morning and the earth rotates. But facts like that aren't always agreed upon. Look, when we say that the sun rises each morning, we assume that that's the same sun day after day, an idea that might not have been accepted by ancient Egyptians, whose mythology taught them that the sun died with every sunset and was reborn with every sunrise. Now, let's consider the case of the Earth's rotation. Well, for most of human history, the Earth was assumed to be stationary at the center of the universe. So, as you can see, our interpretations of facts often are based on beliefs about the world that others might not share. Still, facts are the raw material that scientific models seek to explain, so it's important that scientists agree on the facts. How can we do that?
How about this? A fact has to be verified. I mean, that's where the testing comes in. So we have to be able to test a model, but we have to be able to test a fact too, right?
Now you're on the right track. In the context of science, a fact must therefore be something that anyone can verify for himself or herself, at least in principle. So, even though the interpretation may be different, some interpretation of the sun is there every morning, and that can be verified. Then a model's proposed to explain the facts. And a model is?
An explanation of the facts.
Right. Once the facts have been observed, a model can be proposed to explain them and not only explain what's obvious, but also make predictions that can be tested through further observations or experiments. Let's go back to Ptolemy's model of the universe, which assumed that the Earth was the center of everything. Okay, that was a useful model because it predicted future locations of the sun, moon, and planets in the sky. However, although the Ptolemaic model remained in use for nearly 1,500 years, eventually it became clear that its predictions didn't quite match actual observations, a key reason why the Earth-centered model of the universe finally was discarded.
So models are discarded when they don't match the observations.
Exactly, and new models are proposed to explain the facts in a better or more inclusive way. Okay, how does a model achieve the status of a theory?
Well, I guess sometimes the model doesn't fail. It gets repeated by many experiments, and the predictions are verified.
So when a prediction's verified, repeated, then we start to assume that the model's a valid representation of nature. And when that happens, with many experiments and a number of different researchers, then the model achieves the status of a scientific theory.
But...
Yes, Jerry?
Well, the problem is that theories get discarded too, don't they?
Absolutely, because it isn't really possible to prove that a theory is true beyond all shadow of a doubt. And that's good because doubt is a cornerstone of science. Even a well-researched and presented theory should undergo continuous challenges from the scientific community with further observations and experiments.
I'm sorry. Did we mention the term hypothesis? Does that fit in with a model or a theory?
Glad you brought that up. A proposed model is often called a hypothesis, and that just means that the scientist is making an educated guess that the model's predictions will bear up under testing.
So a hypothesis is a proposed model.
Right. But let's put this all together, shall we? Step 1's observation, the collection of data, that is, observations. Step 2's hypothesis, or a model to explain the facts and to make predictions. Step 3's additional observations and experiments. And here's the important part. When the predictions fail, then we recognize that the model's flawed, and we have to revise or discard it. But when the predictions are verified on a consistent basis, then we consider the possibility that we have a true representation of nature, and we elevate the model to the status of a theory.
So step 4 is the theory?
Right. But even then, the theory must undergo step 5. That's further observations, experiments, and challenges. Okay so far? Okay. Now for a reality check. In the real world of science, discoveries are rarely made by a process as mechanical as the idealized scientific method outlined in your textbook, the one that we just summarized. For example, anyone recognize the name Johannes Kepler?
Sure. Didn't he propose the laws of planetary motion?
He did, in about 1600. But instead of verifying new predictions on the basis of his model, he tested the model against observations that had been made previously. And like most scientific discoveries, Kepler's work involved intuition, collaboration with others, moments of insight, and luck. And eventually, other scientists made a lot of observations to verify the planetary positions predicted by his model.
Go ahead.
So the scientific method in the book, that's not really the way it happens a lot of the time?
Okay, let's put it this way. The scientific method's a process that we need to keep in mind as we do the work of scientists. But we should also understand that it's an idealized process for making objective judgments about whether a proposed model of nature's close to the truth. And we should also keep in mind that in the work of scientists, other factors are also brought to bear on those ideal steps in the process.
46. What is this discussion mainly about? 47. Why did the professor give the example of the ancient Egyptians? 48. Listen again to part of the discussion and then answer the following question.
So a hypothesis is a proposed model.
Right. But let's put this all together, shall we?
Why did the professor say this?
But let's put this all together, shall we?
(49) According to the professor, what did Kepler do to verify his theory of planetary motion? 50. What can be concluded from information in this discussion? 51. What technique does the professor use to explain the practical application of the scientific method?